In the autumn of 1988, Charles Hawtrey was given a choice no comic actor could turn into a joke. Doctors believed that, to save his life, his legs would have to be amputated. Hawtrey refused. For a man whose whole screen presence had depended on a frail little body, quick feet, sharp timing, and that unmistakable pair of spectacles, the decision carried a terrible sort of dignity. This is not where people expect a story about Carry On to begin. They expect saucy postcards, hospital corridors, silly uniforms, and Kenneth Williams raising an eyebrow as if the entire British Empire had just misbehaved. They expect laughter, and quite rightly. Hawtrey had helped provide it for millions. But by October 1988, the laughter was elsewhere. Hawtrey was 73, living in and around Deal, on the Kent coast, far from the busy film sets where he had once been instantly recognisable. The bright, cramped world of British comedy had moved on. The old faces were still loved, but love on a television screen is a curious thing. It can make a man familiar to strangers, while leaving him painfully alone. In his final weeks, Hawtrey was not simply an aging actor with a difficult reputation. He was the remains of a whole vanished style of entertainment. Cheap, cheerful, slightly naughty, and very hard to kill. Carry On had made him famous, but it had also fixed him in the public mind as one particular creature. Thin, nervous, camp, absurd, and endlessly available for a laugh. The question is not whether Charles Hawtrey was loved. He was. Britain never quite forgot that face. The more uncomfortable question is whether anyone ever truly saw the man behind it. And when he finally refused to be saved, was it stubbornness, exhaustion, pride, or simply the last private decision left to a very private man? For many viewers, Charles Hawtrey did not need an introduction. He entered a scene almost like punctuation. Thin, bespectacled, slightly alarmed, and somehow pleased with the trouble about to unfold. He was not built like a leading man, which in British comedy was often a considerable advantage. When Carry On Sergeant arrived in 1958, Britain was still living with the habits of the post-war years. Money was tight, class manners mattered, and people knew the value of a cheap laugh. The Carry On films offered exactly that. Broad humour, quick innuendo, daft authority figures, and a cast who seemed to understand the national talent for embarrassment. Hawtrey fitted the world perfectly. He could look innocent and improper at the same time, a skill more useful in Carry On than any dramatic speech. Around him were Sid James with his wicked laugh, Kenneth Williams with his magnificent outrage, Joan Sims with her warmth and timing, Hattie Jacques with her authority, and later Barbara Windsor, bringing a very different sort of sparkle. Hawtrey was smaller than all of them, in almost every obvious sense, yet he was never invisible. Part of his appeal was that he appeared to have wandered in from another, slightly stranger England. His voice was high and precise, his body all angles, his eyes magnified behind those famous round glasses. He often looked as though he had just discovered a scandal and was secretly delighted by it. That was his magic. He did not have to shout. By the 1960s, Carry On had become part of Britain's comic furniture. Not elegant furniture, perhaps. More like a wobbly chair everyone kept, because it had been in the family for years. Hawtrey was one of its most recognisable ornaments, but recognition is not the same as understanding. The public knew the face, the voice, the manner. The man behind them remained far harder to place. Before he was Charles Hawtrey, he was George Frederick Joffre Hawtrey, born in Hounslow in 1914. It was not a name that seemed built for a cinema poster. Then again, few lives in show business begin with the finished version. The name Charles Hawtrey carried a theatrical echo. It suggested polish, inheritance, a place near the footlights. For a young performer trying to make his way, that sort of name was useful. It gave him a frame before the public had decided what picture belonged inside it. In Britain, where class could be heard in a vowel and guessed from a handshake, even a name could do a little acting. Hawtrey had started early. Long before Carry On, he was a boy soprano, a performer, a young man learning how to hold attention. He trained, sang, acted, and moved through theatre, radio, and film, with the persistence of someone who knew the stage was not merely a hobby. It was an escape route, and perhaps a hiding place. This matters, because the later caricature can make him look accidental. The thin man with the round glasses seems to arrive fully formed, as if he had been invented in a prop cupboard at Pinewood. But Hawtrey was not simply a funny face discovered by chance. He had craft. He understood timing, stillness, and the strange power of seeming weaker than everyone else in the room. Yet the question begins here. When George Hawtrey became Charles Hawtrey, did he create a professional mask or discover one already waiting? Many actors build a public self. Hawtrey seemed to live inside his. The mask made him employable, recognisable, and eventually beloved. But it also raised a quieter problem. Once Britain had decided who Charles Hawtrey was, would George Hawtrey ever be allowed back out? In 1958, Carry On Sergeant arrived with modest expectations and a very British understanding of chaos. It was a film about national service, misfit recruits, authority, embarrassment, and the quiet national pleasure of watching discipline fail politely. Nobody could have known that it would begin one of the most recognisable comedy series in British cinema. Hawtrey played Peter Golightly, a name so perfectly Carry On that it almost came with its own raised eyebrow. He was not the loudest presence in the film, and he did not need to be. His gift was interruption. He could tilt a scene with a glance, a nervous movement, or a line delivered as though innocence had just been caught doing something suspicious. The series quickly found its rhythm. Carry On Nurse followed in 1959, then Carry On Teacher, Carry On Constable, and Carry On Regardless. By the early 1960s, Hawtrey had become part of the machinery. Around him, the regular company began to take shape. Kenneth Williams, Hattie Jacques, Kenneth Connor, Joan Sims, Sid James, and, later, Barbara Windsor. It was not glamour in the grand Hollywood sense. It was something more local, more familiar, and probably much cheaper. By the later 1960s, the formula had become unmistakable. Carry On Up the Khyber in 1968 and Carry On Camping in 1969 showed the series at its most confident, outrageous, and cheerfully improper. Hawtrey could appear in the middle of all that noise and somehow make himself distinct. He was a small comic instrument with a very sharp note, never grand but impossible to miss. But success can be a neat little trap. The more audiences laughed at Hawtrey, the more firmly they knew what they wanted from him. Carry On turned his oddness into gold. It also began turning it into a cage. On screen, Charles Hawtrey could seem almost weightless, a little figure blown into the plot by some mischievous British draft. Off-screen, he was not quite so easy to place. Colleagues often remembered him as eccentric, but that word can be too tidy. Hawtrey was not eccentric in the decorative sense. He was eccentric in the inconvenient sense. There are stories from the Carry On world that reveal the atmosphere better than any grand analysis. Kenneth Williams, never a man to leave a weakness unprodded, was said to have hidden Hawtrey's plastic bag on set. Inside were the small necessities of his day: sandwiches, woodbines, and a newspaper. It sounds like a harmless prank, almost a lost scene from the films themselves. Yet in Hawtrey's case, those small possessions seemed to matter. They were part of the little private order he carried into a noisy, teasing workplace. Shayla Hancock later described him as a genuine eccentric, and that feels closer to the truth than calling him merely difficult. Hawtrey could be sharp, vain, guarded, and easily offended. He could also be precise, funny, and oddly magnetic. He had the sort of personality that made people tell stories about him, even when those stories were not entirely kind. The Carry On company has often been remembered as a cheerful family. Like many families, it was probably more complicated from the inside. The jokes did not end when the cameras stopped. For some, that was part of the charm. For Hawtrey, one suspects it could feel less charming when the joke was him. This is where the public image begins to crack. The nervous little man on screen was not simply nervous. The ridiculous figure was not simply ridiculous. Behind the laughter, was someone who needed control, privacy, and respect, even while earning a living by appearing absurd. That is a difficult bargain for any actor. Hawtrey made it for years. The cruel thing about popular comedy is that it can make an actor unforgettable without making him free. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Charles Hawtrey was one of those faces Britain knew at once. The glasses, the voice, the slight tilt of panic, the suggestion that decency had taken a wrong turning, all of it belonged to him. Yet recognition did not necessarily bring security. The Carry On films were famous for their speed, economy, and cheerful lack of grandeur. They worked because the actors knew exactly how to sell the joke, often with very little time and not much money. The public came to think of them almost as national property. The industry, however, did not always treat them like treasures. For Hawtrey, the problem was sharper. He was not simply associated with a kind of comedy, he had become a visual shorthand for it. If a producer wanted frailty, camp mischief, nervous innocence, or a man who looked as if he had overheard something unsuitable at a vicarage, Hawtrey was perfect. If the role required anything far from that, the imagination of the business grew less generous. There was talent beneath the typecasting. He had started as a performer long before Carry On, and he understood craft better than his later image suggested. But the very precision of his comic persona worked against him. Audiences loved the familiar note. Producers kept asking him to play it. Meanwhile, Britain itself was changing. By the early 1970s, television was stronger, satire had sharpened, and younger audiences were beginning to hear old jokes differently. Carry On still had life, but the world around it was moving. Hawtrey's oddness, once turned into gold, began to look like a fixed address, and that is a lonely place for an actor. To be remembered is a gift. To be remembered only one way can feel like a sentence. After Carry On Abroad in 1972, something important had changed. Charles Hawtrey had not vanished, but the place where audiences most expected to find him had closed its door. For 14 years, Carry On had given him a reliable frame. Without it, he remained familiar, yet strangely harder to use. There are careers that end with a public farewell. Hawtrey's did not. His decline was quieter, more awkward, and more British. He appeared here and there, sometimes on stage, sometimes on television, but never again with the same central place in the national comedy machine. The country still knew him. The business had less idea what to do with him. By then, the difficulties around him were harder to ignore. Stories about drinking followed him, and it would be easy, though rather lazy, to reduce the later years to that alone. Alcohol did damage, so did pride, loneliness, and the simple fact that show business has a short memory when a performer becomes inconvenient. Hawtrey could be funny, but he was not always easy. In an industry built on good humour, being difficult can be a dangerous hobby. Deal, on the Kent coast, became his final landscape. It was not exile in the dramatic sense. There were pubs, sea air, local recognition, and the peculiar dignity of a small English town where people notice everything, but do not always interfere. Still, it was a long way from Pinewood, from the bustle of costume departments, from the conspiratorial laughter of a cast who knew exactly how to make nonsense work. The saddest part is not that Hawtrey left Carry On. Many actors survive a famous part. The saddest part is that, once Carry On no longer carried him, the public had nowhere else to put him. The face remained famous. The man behind it grew increasingly remote. When Charles Hawtrey died in October 1988, Britain lost more than a familiar comic face. It lost one of the odd little notes in a tune everyone thought they knew. He had never been the grandest star of Carry On, and perhaps he would have found that phrase rather vulgar anyway. But remove him from those films, and something essential goes missing. His comedy was not built on strength. It was built on angles, hesitations, sudden glances, and the marvelous suggestion that respectability had just slipped on a banana skin. He could make a scene feel less orderly simply by standing in it. That is a rarer gift than it sounds. Many actors can deliver a joke, Fewer can become the joke without surrendering their intelligence. The final years were lonely, and they should not be polished into something they were not. He lived with illness, a difficult reputation, and the consequences of a life not easily shared. Yet it would be unfair to leave him only there, in the shadow of Deal, as if the ending explained the whole man. It does not. Endings rarely do. Charles Hawtrey belonged to a particular Britain. Post-war cinemas, Saturday evenings, repeated television screenings, and laughter that arrived with a nudge rather than a sermon. Some of that humour has aged. Some of it now feels creaky, as old furniture often does. But performance is another matter. Timing survives. Presence survives. That strange, sharp, bespectacled figure survives. His tragedy was not that Britain forgot him. Britain never quite forgot. The deeper sadness is that it remembered him so clearly in one form that the rest of him became blurred. Still, there is honour in being part of people's memories, especially the untidy, affectionate memories that comedy leaves behind. If you remember him from those old Saturday evenings, let us know which Charles Hawtrey moment stayed with you. Or perhaps there is another British star from your childhood you would like us to remember next.